Hello, welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about adolescence. So what do you think the show Adolescence teaches us about adolescence?
I mean, that is the question, isn't it? And I think one of the reasons why we are going to try and answer that question is because the show gives itself that single word title, adolescence, almost like the beginning of a essay question, which is, I suppose, relevant since it's partly about school children or secondary school children. And of course the question is there, whether they are still children or not.
Yeah.
And it's adolescence with a capital A, as if to say, here is the subject under discussion. And it's not, as it might have been, a poetic title. They could have taken a quote from Shakespeare or another type of quote, as this kind of production sometimes does, like, To Kill a Mockingbird or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It could have been something a bit more elusive and poetic, but it's not. It's direct, it's frontal, as if to say, we're treating this subject matter in all its warts and all unvarnished reality, which I think is part of the whole approach of the film, to take something straight on, or appear to take something straight on. And in that respect, it seems to be evocative of as much, as I say, essay writing, reportage or analysis as it is of drama. And yet, on the other hand, because it is a single word, unadorned, it's all the more dramatic for that.
Yeah.
So already we have, I think, this tension between the real and the dramatic, which the storytelling itself tries to combine, as if to say, the very ordinary life of these people becomes very extraordinary. And at a very simple level, that's what this 4-part series is doing. It's showing the extraordinary, the unusual, the dramatic, the remarkable within the context of something very ordinary, in an ordinary family, in an ordinary part of the country.
Yeah.
So I think all of that is going on. I think it's worth saying that this pared down style has all sorts of antecedents. I mentioned the word reality. There's a tiny bit of reality TV in it, but not too much. There's a bit of the idea of cinema verite, telling a story in a very straight fashion. And I think there is a Brechtian tradition here of making the filmmaking as, on the one hand, as smooth as possible, but on the other hand, very conspicuously a virtuoso form of storytelling. And one of the first things we all learned about adolescence, even if we're not experts, is that this was all filmed in one, each episode was filmed in one shot. And I think that both hides and foregrounds the technical mastery of the storytelling. So it's Brechtian in that sense. I'm referring to Bertolt Brecht, the German.
So you mean it's quite simple in that it's one shot, but then obviously they must have gone to a lot of trouble to make it so smooth.
Exactly. And, again, from the tiny bit I've heard about it, and it's spoken about a lot, obviously, it took a lot of effort to create that very simple story, lots of rehearsals and so on. So I think those are interesting aspects. Adolescence takes us straight into something that's both simple and complex at the same time. I mean, I've answered your question on a slightly stand back meta or abstract level. In terms of the theme itself, adolescence, the word is interesting, adolescence, because adolescence is that stage, obviously, between childhood and adulthood. The word adolescence means becoming an adult, like senescence is becoming old, juvenescence is becoming young. And the word becoming and the word adult is interesting. I was trying to find out about the etymological background of the word adolescence. And it's obviously related to the word adult and becoming adult, the AD part of it, moving towards something. It's unclear to me, and even the research I've done on the word, whether the word adult is also or not related to adulterate, adultery, and things that are spoiled or not. Perhaps somebody viewing can help me on that, because I've only got so far in that investigation.
Is that like William Blake?
Well, I was thinking of William Blake too, because the word is adolescence, which, I mean, we're recording this in 2025, and the word is still current, But I associate the word also with an earlier generation too. It's a word that supersedes the word teenage. Teenage is a word that I think was invented in the 1950s, I think, or became current at least in the 1950s, particularly around films like Rebel Without a Cause, which isolated that phase of human life as worthy of inspection and trouble, if you like. So it's in that lineage, which goes back to things like Rebel Without a Cause. In a moment I'll talk about much older lineage in this, because I think it goes back to all the way back to Sophocles and Greek drama, but maybe we can come back to that. But as you say, there is in William Blake this debate, I suppose, between innocence and experience. Of course, this isn't called Innocence and Experience, or the transition from innocence to experience, but that is one of the key themes, and how somebody who's aged 13, I think we'll come back to the age as well, can be both innocent and experienced at the same time, and adolescence as a period which marks both a transition from one to the other, but also a confusion of one and the other, and the false growing up, which really is the subject of this film. You can go from childhood through adolescence, and you may not arrive at adulthood. You may arrive at a distorted version of adulthood, which leads to the tragic events that we're describing here.
And I think today the word adolescence kind of feels a bit clinical, like it's something like in the doctors, they describe a person.
Very much so. And although we'll talk about all these themes to do with boyhood and manhood and masculinity and so on, I think for me, the film is at least about not just clinical practice, but institutional process. And each of the 4 episodes seems to me, apart from being an essay or disquisition on adolescence, also an exploration of different institutions. So in the first one, it's the institution and process of the police, the arrest. In the second one, it's the school, the institution and processes of the institution of the school. In the third one, it's the institution of psychology, or clinical psychology, as represented by the psychologist within the detention facility. And finally, the institution of the family, I think. And I would say, as much as it's an analysis of adolescence, it is an investigation of the ways in which each of those 4 institutions contains anxiety, but also produces anxiety, and then finds itself on the cusp between those 2 things all of the time. So in the police cells, for example, the police cells are places where people are, by definition, contained and detained. And at the same time, we hear shouting from the cells and foul language. The school is at once a place of rules and order, but also a place of fights and a place of disturbance and a place of also foul language. The psychologist in the 3rd episode is very clearly adhering to a set of professional guidelines and practices. And at the same time, we see that tested to the limit, partly through the explosions of Jamie's temper at a couple of points, and also at the end where we see her breaking into tears, where we see the limits of that professional practice. And we see throughout that interview the way in which her approach threatens to spill over always into the uncontained. And then with the family right at the end, which is interesting because the father's going through an adolescence of his own, a becoming adult of his own, significantly at the age of 50, which is his own climacteric. There are moments of his own anger spilling over, his own uncontained behaviour, and the attempts at containment by his wife and his daughter, who is representing another version of adolescence in her own right, because we see her 13 months on from the previous scene, and obviously she's developing into, or has developed into a woman. And I should say in brackets, the number 13 comes up a few times in the series.
Yeah, because he's 13 years old, 13 months.
Yeah. And there are questions of luck and chance and contingency. Did this have to happen or not? Is Jamie's behaviour partly attributable or not to the parents, and so on? And I think one of the other connotations of the word adolescence in the and the essence part of it, becoming adult, is that it's a process. And because it's a process, it's the adolescents, TS, are vulnerable to change during that time and are therefore shapeable and malleable, and they can be influenced. And the word influence is obviously one of the important words behind this film, because if we think of the word online influencers, but they can be influenced and shaped in different ways, because the adolescent brain, to use a more clinical language, has yet to be set completely. And therefore, there's this open question, I think, throughout of what the formation will be of an adolescent, because it can go in various ways, and it can be up to a point influenced by parents, but can be also influenced by school, and can be influenced, which is the focus of this particular series, by online discussions.
The first relationship we saw was the inspector on the phone to his son, or listening to the voice message from his son, and he ignores it and then goes on to raid the house. So right from the beginning we see these relationships of father and son relationships. How are those relationships different from each other, and how are they similar?
Yeah, we have that in the first episode, and in the second episode we have or is it the third episode actually, a rapprochement really between the detective inspector and his son Adam, where they get in the car together and go and have chips. But it takes a while for that relationship to approach that point. And interestingly, the pivot, well, there are a few pivot points, but one of the key moments is Adam actually explaining to his father the meaning of the emojis and the color coding of emojis in the Instagram messages. And one of the interesting themes throughout is the reverse teaching that goes on, ways in which adults themselves are in a learning process, being taught by their children or other children about life in a way that one might have thought was just the prerogative of the adults. And of course, we know that the detective inspector is not living with his son. There's obviously been a divorce or a breakup at some point. He's a girlfriend instead. So we know that that is a relationship that has at some point been rattled or damaged in some way, now as undergoing a process of potential repair. I mean, it's in the balance a little bit during that film. But we do have that relationship, the father-son relationship, and the development in that relationship seems to come through a conversation where really the barriers come down on both sides. We then obviously have the Jamie father and his father relationship, which perhaps is the most central relationship of all the relationships in the film, but it's easy to say that, and I'm not 100% sure that is the most important relationship there. We also have the relationship between the father and his father, which is spoken about, and the father's keen desire not for the sins of the father, as it were, not to be repeated. And there is that question about where attribution lies for Jamie's act, whether it's something passed down through the generations, whether the abuse that's gone on in earlier generations has been sufficiently interrupted by his own father. And of course, his own father can't quite manage his own temper, or not. So there's a classic question there about nurture versus nature, to what degree is Jamie naturally susceptible to these aggressive instincts? Is it cultural? Is it online? And so on. But I think those are the three main father-son relationships that we have going on. And one of those most significant moments in the film, in the series, which is returned to in the fourth part, is the moment at which Jamie chooses his quote-unquote appropriate adult. He's given the choice. It can be somebody external or it can be a parent. He chooses a parent and he chooses his father. And I think there's a lot going on in that at that moment, because I think we're invited to ask ourselves, is there a sense in which Jamie at that point is asking his father to be or to have been more of a role model than he might have otherwise been, even though clearly the father, for all his faults, in a sense, is, to use a psychoanalytic term, is a good enough father, and his mother's a good enough mother. They're not perfect, but they're good enough.
Jamie's father comes up a lot in the police and with the psychologist. They're kind of trying to get it. They're trying to blame the father for what the son's done. Like even before they interview the boy, the inspector kind of says, "Oh, you know, normally these things. It turns out the dad is the bad person in this, and he's been molesting the boy, and that's why he does it." And then during the interviews with the psychologist, she's asking a lot of questions about his relationship with his father. So I think it seems like society is putting a lot of blame on the dad.
There is a question for sure about role models there, male role models. This is filmed at a time, in 2025, when there's a lot of discussion about the radicalization of young men. In this case, it's the radicalization in the direction of misogyny and incel behavior. We're also aware of other forms of radicalization of particularly young men in terms of far right-wing ideologies, Islamist ideologies, and so on. And in all cases, I think we are aware of the idea that young men need better male role models. Fathers, yes, other males in their community too. And I was also thinking of knife crime and the degree, and of course this is partly about knife crime, although that's not played up particularly. I wouldn't go quite so far as you as to say that he is blamed.
I don't think he's blamed. I think they want to blame him. They think it would be easy if it were true.
It would be easy if it were true. I think one of the many tragedies here, and of course the main tragedy here, is the tragedy that pertains to the victim. And in brackets, this is a film about perpetrators and not victims, really. And we can talk about whether that's good or bad. But one of the many tragedies here is actually the fact that the father's blame of himself is always going to exceed the blame attributed to him by other people. And the very last scene is with him in tears on his son's bed, still actually blaming himself. And I don't think any form of other people blaming him is going to outstrip that. Yeah, I mean, there is an obvious question here about where does blame lie? I think blame is a secondary question here in relation to what I think are primary questions, which are to do mainly with the notion of safety. So I'd like to come back to that. But when it comes to blame, there does seem to be an open question there. Who is to blame? Is there some intrinsic evil in Jamie? So that's the kind of internalized function there. Is he just a wrong 'un? Do we blame the parents? Do we blame the online influencers? Do we blame the school? Do we blame other institutions, society, and so on? The question of blame is interesting to me in relation to this notion of Greek tragedy, and I know it may seem like a very far-fetched thing to say that there is a relation to Greek tragedy, but just bear with me a second on this. So the conflict or tension between teenagers and people in authority goes back to me in its lineage to Sophocles' play Antigone, which is about a teenage girl wanting to bury her brother when the brother has violated the rules of the city, basically. And there's a massive conflict between her, Antigone, and her uncle, Creon. And it's an intergenerational conflict. And one of the things which connects Adolescence to that, in a sense, original play and tragedy, is partly the question of blame, but also partly the sense that teenagers, adolescents, in their process of separating from their parents, and I'd like also to talk about attachment theory here, have to find their own language and rules and way of being, which is separate from that of the adults. So they're becoming adult, but in the process of becoming adolescents, they are becoming anything but their parents, anything but the other adults, teachers, policemen, whatever they know. So yes, there may be role models, but there's a part of being a teenager or adolescent which says, I will never be the same as you. I won't do it like you will. Just as Jamie's father says of his own father, that they won't repeat. So they are becoming adult, but crucially in a way that will now deviate from, improve upon, and implicitly overcome the forms of adulthood which they have witnessed among all the fallible adults, parents, teachers that they've grown up with. And for Antigone in Sophocles' play, that's through asserting her own way of doing things to bury her brother, which is against the rule of the state. In this series, Adolescence, teenagers have their own world, coded language online, mainly on Instagram, which the adults have to both try and understand, but are also trying to police in some way, literally, small p and capital P. So the question of blame then becomes complicated, because blame belongs to the judicial system and the social system owned and run by the grown-ups in that world. But the teenagers have their own version of morality and codes and right and wrong and virtue and vice and so on. And who's to blame within the world of the teenage online environment might be very different from who's to blame in the adult world. And of course, the worst example of that is the implication that the victim is to blame. She brought it on herself, which is obviously an outrageous thing to think from the point of view of the grown-ups in that system. So we are brought into this awful question which says, is the victim to blame or is the perpetrator to blame? And even to have that question posed is astonishing, but of course that's the world, the incel world, in fact the Andrew Tate world, who's referenced in that we are brought to think about against our will. The connection with Greek drama, Greek tragedy, is that the very word tragedy is based on the word, might sound a bit weird, tragos, goat, the scapegoat. Who is going to be the scapegoat who is sacrificed here and ridden out of town? I should say in brackets, there are other contenders for the etymological root of the word scapegoat and tragedy and so on. But nevertheless, there is that other reference there. Because we are watching a tragedy. This is a modern day tragedy. There is a semi-reconciliation at the end, which is produced by effectively the boy's confession, but it follows those rules. And since I'm banging on about Greek tragedy here, I probably ought to mention it corresponds quite strongly with Aristotle's theory of how plays should work. Aristotle in his Poetics talks about how drama should have a unity of time and place and action, and that's what this does. It's all contained, or each episode is contained in one place with a set of characters and so on. So it's Aristotelian in that sense. And actually even the murder, which is filmed on videotape, we only see really a little bit obscurely. It's on a laptop over the shoulder of the father or others in the police cell. So it's shown but kind of not shown at the same time.
Yeah, we just see the reaction of everyone else watching.
I mean, I think we also see elements of the attack.
Yeah, but only a bit. It's more focused on the dad's reaction, really.
Yeah, so it's kind of on stage in Aristotelian terms, but it's mainly not on stage. And of course, for the purposes of the drama, there is a lingering minor doubt throughout as to whether possibly that wasn't him who did it. Compelling, they use the word compelling regarding the evidence early on. Compelling though that evidence seems to be. So anyway, so when I say, this drama has antecedents in as far back as Sophocles, yes, through Brecht and others, I think that, and that's true. The way in which it works, it is a tragedy. There are these Aristotelian rules in place. There is this question of the scapegoat, who's going to be blamed, and so on. I just want to reiterate the point that this is a film about perpetrators, and I'm sure other people will make this point, and maybe it's a virtue signalling point on my part. We don't really hear the victim's side or story or her family or her family system. We have the friend. Quite a lot of time is given to the friend. Interesting time. She's a very interesting, complex character with her own adolescence that she's going through. But nevertheless, this is a story about perpetrators and the effect on the perpetrator system. So the film is called Adolescence. And from the point of view of the parent, a question around adolescence is how much freedom to give teenagers and how much constraint, and how much risk is involved when the constraints are relaxed. In the film there, the boy, Jamie, is allowed clearly to be on his phone late into the night and even after the lights turned off, probably. We are invited to think about the question of online safety, because clearly he's been looking at stuff online, and there's a pretty obvious sense in which we, the viewer, are being asked to reflect on modern day concerns about online safety and the policing of that space and algorithms and radicalization and so on. But for me, the key question in the film is, where is safety? What is safety? So the school, the police cell, the psychologist, the family are all attempting in their various ways to create a safe space in which their work can be undertaken. So the work of the school is to educate, the work of the police is to enforce the law, the work of the psychologist is to reveal motive, the work of the family is to produce upbringing or to enable upbringing. And in all cases, we are exposed to the possibility that those safe spaces can also become unsafe.
Yeah.
So the family becomes an unsafe space towards the end in the final episode because of the father's distress. The police station is always at threat of becoming an unsafe space because its rules and procedures might not contain the anxiety. The school is always at risk of becoming an unsafe space.
There's fights and
because of the fights and so on. So I think safety is the key thing here. And I'm reminded of the work of a psychoanalyst called Isabel Minges, spelt Menzies, Isabel Minges Lythe, who wrote about anxiety in institutions. So I'm going back a little bit on what I said before. She wrote studies about the NHS and the army, and she was arguing essentially the reason why there are so many rules in hospital about making beds and having a fixed time for medicines and waking patients up even when they're asleep to give them their medicines and so on, is that there's so much potential in a hospital for distress because there's sickness and blood and illness and vomit and death and so on, that those rules have to be in place to contain that anxiety.
yeah.
And I would say that safety is the existential question par excellence for us as human beings. You know, how safe am I at any point? Clearly, for the victim in this drama, she wasn't safe enough, and she was murdered. But if you were to take this down to its most existential elements, I think, for me at least, what it discloses is that hard up against the notion of what it is to exist as a human being and to grow as a human being, because as human beings, we don't just exist, we exist in time. And as we exist in time, we grow and we go through phases. As we exist, therefore, our question of safety changes. Now, as babies, safety should be absolute and guaranteed because we are completely helpless. As adolescents, that becomes a question because our safety, the safety net around us, has to be slowly and subtly withdrawn so that we develop the skills and agency and resilience in order to survive on our own terms. But then too much lack of safety leads to danger. And I suppose if I were to describe this series in existential terms, I'd say it's about the interplay of safety and danger.
I wanted to go back to Jamie and his dad. So Jamie says, my dad didn't hit me, if that's what you're getting at. And then later we see his dad saying, oh, my dad used to hit me and I was never going to do that with my son. And I feel like the dad maybe thought that was enough.
Yeah, maybe the dad thought it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe the dad thought it was enough just to refrain from violence. Yeah. But at the same time, he's also affectionate with his son. Despite his faults, he is warm, and he is the one that he's chosen to be the appropriate adult. He could have chosen the mother, the maternal presence, and she's clearly a good mother, certainly at least a good enough mother, as we were saying before.
Another thing that's referenced twice from both the son and the father is at the football game when he looks at his dad and his dad doesn't look at him. And he's looking for that reassurance from his dad.
Yeah.
He doesn't get it, and his dad says the same thing, I couldn't look at him.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's linked to when he asks the psychologist, do you like me? And there's this thing, I think it feels like this thing is replaying of him wanting people to like him. He's not receiving it in just those little moments. And, you know, he asks the girl out and she laughs in his face.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the profound question that Jamie is holding. Am I accepted for who I am, or do I have to be somebody different? Because he's clearly quite arty, for example, rather than sporty.
Yeah.
And the father himself is not resolved on that question. He wants his son to be good at football and boxing. But by the end of the series, we have him appreciating his son's drawing. And of course, he's drawn the birthday card for his dad. Yeah. So there is, you know, at a more simple level, there's a question, is it okay to be a arty boy rather than a macho boy? A boy who doesn't particularly want to have sex yet, or isn't yet into girls or whatever. Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah.
You know, because the influences he's seeing online are saying, no, that's not okay. You have to be a particular type of man, quite macho, and even as if there is some correspondence between the two, misogynistic, as though there's some sick correspondence between masculinity and androgyny, which is the kind of awful thing that he's obviously been drawn into.
And he's got quite an aversion to being. He's got quite an aversion to perhaps being gay, like the psychologist kind of.
Yeah, and maybe he is, maybe he isn't.
A few times he's like, I'm not gay, I'm not gay.
No, maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but he's being asked to grow up too soon and choose a version of masculinity when he's not ready. And his father, as was saying, himself also has or has had a version of masculinity which sits alongside something more evolved. So the father has both this sort of reptilian brain and a more evolved brain.
Yeah.
There's the brain who can't look at his son for being rubbish at football, and the brain which appreciates his artistic skills. So there is that ambiguity in the father, which is unresolved. And it's carried over, into the son. And in that sense, there's a responsibility on the part of the father. But, no parent can be perfect in that regard.
Perhaps that's why it is confusing for Jamie, because he's got an affectionate dad who he seems to be able to speak to, and his dad hugs him and stuff. But then there's these moments where his dad rejects him, and that's confusing because he probably feels it even more because of that.
It's confusing, but again, in terms of, I referenced this term "good enough," which is Klein, as in Melanie Klein. It's a Kleinian term about particularly mothers being good enough. One of the other key things Melanie Klein says is that the process of growing up, adolescence, is the ability to hold contradictory truths in your mind at the same time. And the truth is, his dad has elements of old school, aggressive, possibly misogynistic maleness about him. And at the same time, he seems an evolved, enlightened, caring, thoughtful father, and indeed husband, and also father to his daughter. Both things are true.
Yeah.
And the question for the growing mind, for all of us as adults, is can we manage the ambiguity in life? Can we manage the ambiguity that we ourselves and other people, both good and bad, in them? Now, we have extremes of badness here. We have the ultimate badness, which is murder. As if the absolute there somehow resolves things, as if you can't be absolutely good, you'll be absolutely bad, as though that's some sort of solution. Of course it isn't. And what we think of as maturity is the ability to occupy a middle ground, which is a bit grey and made up of black and white, and a space of negotiation and reflection and accommodation and toleration, really, which is that almost a difficult space to occupy for anybody, but that is the root of becoming adult.
So the daughter is quite interesting, and we see him parenting the daughter quite a few times, like telling her not to use that language, even though the language isn't that bad. Do you think there would have been a difference between the way he parents the boy and the girl?
Possibly. I mean, it's on the language point, he himself swears a lot. So again, we get this double character contained in him, one less evolved and one more evolved. Does he parent her differently? There's possibly something which slightly idealizes the daughter more than the son, but I'm not sure that's completely true, because he is also affectionate with Jamie. He puts his arm around him. He speaks to him in a kind of soft way, generally. There's a moment in the prison cell when he is playing the appropriate adult where he looks away from Jamie again as if in shame, like he might have done at the football match. But I wouldn't want to exaggerate the difference there. And I wouldn't want to say that the family is a patriarchy rather than a matriarchy and so on. For me, the interesting thing there is we have a family of 4. It's a nuclear family. There's a boy and a girl. You know, we are being presented with gender difference and a difference between the boy and the girl, but not necessarily along gender lines per se, even though Jamie is very clearly being sucked into a highly gendered manosphere or boyosphere. I think what we're really seeing is that the daughter is in her own way reasonably successfully negotiating adolescence.
Yeah, she seems like she's allowed to grow up a bit more naturally.
Yes, except the tragedy for her, as for her parents, is that she, as she says quite explicitly, she's known as Jamie's sister. And that maybe forever will be defining of her identity, just as being Jamie's parents will be defining the identity of the parents. And, you know, she tells them, don't move away, because you can't run away from the label. You have to find a way of working with it, incorporating it and overcoming it. And that's another interesting example of the adults being taught by the, in her case, not quite a child now, but by the adolescents.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and join our members area. See you in the next one.